All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We are doing a hybrid PhD defense today, so it's the first time we've done this, so just bear with us in terms of the technology. We have a lot of buttons we have to push up here to make things go. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Katya Jay, who's doing her PhD defense for us. And oops, I already messed it up. This is frozen. Great. Okay, thank you. So Katya came to us from Macalester College, and she, while she was at Macalester, she did a number of research projects, undergrad research projects, one of which involved actually publishing a paper on spiders in tropical rainforests in Australia, which is pretty different environment than dunes, as you might imagine. So obviously her research involves dunes. And when I think of Katya, I think of somebody who has really strong field research skills, quantitative skills. And so she was very perfect for this, this PhD project, I think. She did her work, obviously, in dunes, but she ended up working out on the US Atlantic coast. So a completely different system than we have here in the Pacific Northwest. And so this was an opportunity to really compare these Atlantic systems with the Pacific systems. And Katya did a great job with that comparison, as you will see. These dunes are isolated out on barrier islands, so there's not a lot of people around on some of these islands. You can see they look pretty desolate. There are, though, where there are people, those people really don't want you to be on the dune. So she had to basically, dodge all these private properties and so forth to do her work. Katya also had great collaborative skills while she was here. We worked in a team with Peter Ruggiero's group here at OSU and also Laura Moore's group at UNC Chapel Hill and all their students. And you can see here some photos of us in the field together. And Katya, she ended up going to the Outer Banks about 4 or 5 times. So she had to coordinate all this work with other people. And while Katya was here, she also did a lot of teaching. So she taught the by 21X series, I think every year, probably. So she's, contributed greatly to our teaching mission here at OSU. She also taught with me by 450, which is a marine biology class out at Hatfield, but we had to do it remotely. And so she stepped up and helped me teach a field course remotely without any field work involved. So it was quite an experience, and I really appreciated her help with that. She also mentored a lot of undergrads in our lab, and she'll talk some of her research today will highlight some of the work that they helped her with. And then the other cool thing about Katya is that she won a bunch of awards. So she won 2 Geological Society of America awards while she was here. One of them was the John A. Black Award, which is an award for coastal processes, field-based coastal processes for students who are working in that realm. She also won a Garden Club of America award that allowed her to use some of that money to go to North Carolina. And then finally, she won this Presidential Management Fellowship Award, which she can tell you more about. I don't know a lot about it, but it's a pretty prestigious thing to receive. All right. And Katya has a very exciting future. She's going to work as a postdoc at University of Colorado in Boulder. So she's going to leave us and go work in these alpine systems, plant systems at Niwot Ridge, which is an LTR in Colorado. So great next step for Katya, and we'll definitely miss her. So without further ado, Katya, why don't you come up and tell us about your work.
Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction, Sally, and thanks to everyone who's here today. I really appreciate all of your support, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you all what I've been working on over the last 5 years, where I've been exploring the role of dune grasses, carbon storage, and marine nutrients to the ecosystem functions and services of US Central Atlantic coast dunes. So coastal interface habitats occur where the land meets the sea, creating a spatial transition between terrestrial and marine environments. Because of their position at this interface of terrestrial and marine processes, these habitats provide unique ecosystem services, including coastal protection, recreation, carbon sequestration, and other things as well. These systems also tend to have disproportionately high human population densities. So because of this, they're at the forefront of climate change, both in terms of helping to regulate coastal hazard exposure, and also because they're highly vulnerable to changes, including sea level rise, extreme storm events, and coastal erosion, as well as coastal development. And these are all things that could reduce or shift these ecosystem services in the future. So one really widespread interface habitat is that of sandy beaches and dunes, which also provide important ecosystem services, including the ones that I just mentioned. And these are really interesting systems for studying both biological and geological processes and their interactions and how those feedbacks influence ecosystem functions and services, which is what I'll be talking to you about today. The dunes act as the first line of defense against storm surges and flooding by attenuating wave energy and reducing overtopping. And they act as an alternative source of protection over gray infrastructure. So that's human engineered structures such as seawalls and shoreline armoring, which can be really costly and can lead to steeper and narrower beaches over time. Dunes can also store carbon, as can other coastal ecosystems. So by sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it in their vegetation and their sediments below ground. But there's been very little research quantifying carbon storage in dunes, which likely varies based on factors including vegetation density, coastal geomorphology, and sediment supply, and may also be disturbed in the future with climate change. So dunes are very dynamic systems that are constantly changing and are shaped by many different processes, as you can see in this diagram here. So you have marine processes, including sea level and wave conditions that interact with aeolian forces and sedimentary processes to shape dunes. And those factors are also in turn influenced by ecosystem processes, including vegetation and geomorphology. And all of these factors can in turn shape the ecosystem services that dunes provide. And in this talk, I'll be focusing mainly on the feedbacks between vegetation and geomorphology and how that influences coastal protection and carbon sequestration. So to understand dune ecosystem services, we need to know more about how dunes function and understand the role of vegetation in these systems. And we know from previous work that dunes are shaped by feedbacks between vegetation and sediment. Specifically, aeolian sediment transport, which is brought to the dune and then captured by burial tolerant vegetation, including dune grasses, which can stimulate further plant growth and lead to further sand deposition. And through these feedbacks, dunes are shaped. As you can see in this diagram here, this is based on previous work in Sally's lab, especially by Phoebe Zarnetsky, a previous PhD student who investigated these feedbacks on the Pacific Northwest coast. And from previous work in dunes, we also know that the type of plant growth can influence dune morphology. So patchier plant growth tends to lead to more hummocky dunes, while denser, more continuous plant growth will lead to more linear dunes. We also know from this previous work that different species of grasses can shape dune morphology in different ways because of variation in their growth form and in their sand capturing abilities. So in the Pacific Northwest system, you have two invasive Ammophila species, as well as this native grass, Elamis mollis. And looking at this diagram here, you can see how they shape dunes differently. So Ammophila arenaria tends to build these more vertical, narrower dunes because of its high sand capture, whereas Ammophila breviculata has a more lateral growth form that leads to these shorter and wider dunes. And then in contrast, the native species grows much less densely and doesn't really build dunes on its own. So we know a lot about these interactions, especially in Pacific Northwest dunes, but we know less about these processes in other areas, such as the US Atlantic coastline, which brings me to the focus of my dissertation. So the overall goal of my dissertation is to build on this previous research in dunes to explore ecosystem functions and services along the US Central Atlantic coastline. Specifically, my aim is to better understand feedbacks between vegetation and physical factors and to verify whether these processes are similar across coasts, focusing on the role of dune grasses, carbon storage, and marine nutrients in these dune systems. And specifically focusing on these processes in the North Carolina Outer Banks, which is a set of sandy barrier islands with a lot of spatial variability along the coastline. So they're really variable in terms of their vegetation and their coastal geomorphology, as well as their shoreline orientation, as you can see in this map here. This area is also especially vulnerable to things like sea level rise and hurricane events that happen pretty frequently, as well as coastal development. And our team of researchers, as Sally mentioned, from Oregon State and UNC Chapel Hill, established 112 transects along this region that we've been surveying over the last 4 years. And I'll be talking to you a lot more about that in just a few minutes. So along the US Atlantic coast, we have 4 different species of grasses that all overlap in the Outer Banks. And there are differences between these grasses that may be important for dune building. So first, Uniola paniculata is a warm climate grass found from Maryland southward. And Ammophila breviculata is a colder climate grass found from North Carolina northward. So the Outer Banks are kind of the southern extent of its range. And then Sortina patens and Panicum amarum are both widely distributed along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts and are kind of companion dune building species. And I'm going to be referring to these grasses using these 4-letter codes throughout the rest of my talk. Keep an eye out for that. So we know that grasses are important, but we need more research to determine how important they are relative to physical factors. And there were some field experiments starting in the 1970s by Woodhouse and colleagues that found that differences in the morphology and growth form of these grasses led to variation in dune morphology in the field. And what they did was they planted these grasses in monocultures and then observed the morphology of the dune in the years following these plantings. So you can see in the top left here, a dune built by Uniola, which was relatively tall and narrow, in contrast with a dune built by Ammophila, which was much wider and greater in volume, but similar in height. And then lastly, a mixture of Uniola and Panicum still led to narrower dunes in comparison to those built by Ammophila. We also know from previous work by our joint OSU-UNC research team led by Sally, this is some work that we published in 2019, where we showed that differences in the morphology and growth form among these dune grasses actually leads to variation in their sand accretion in the field. So you can see in these photos here, we collected a bunch of specimens of these grasses and then measured their morphology and found some interesting differences. So Ammophila breviculata tends to have high shoot density. In the field, it grows kind of in a really clumpy format and then tends to have tall shoots leading to high sand accretion, whereas in contrast, Uniola grows much less densely and more evenly in the field. So despite having tall, thick shoots, it tends to have less sand accretion. And you can see that in this graph here, where we measured elevation changes over the course of a year in areas that were monocultures of these grasses. And you can see that Ammophila had about 15 centimeters more sand accretion compared to the other 3 species. So my dissertation research uses a combination of observational techniques, laboratory analyses, and statistical approaches to explore dune ecosystem functions and services across the North Carolina Outer Banks. And in my second chapter, I explored the relative roles of sand supply, beach geomorphology, and vegetation in shaping dunes using statistical models. Oops. In my third chapter, I measured carbon storage along the Outer Banks coastline and then examined the role of dune grasses and sand deposition in shaping along shore variability in this ecosystem service. And then in my fourth chapter, I explored whether dune grass production and dune grass tissue nitrogen content varied both regionally and locally as a result of marine nutrients and beach and dune geomorphology. So I'm going to start by talking about my second chapter, where I examined which factors related to sand supply and vegetation can best explain the variability in fore-dune shape that we observe along this coastline. So the two main questions guiding this work were, one, what are the relative roles of sand supply, beach geomorphology, and vegetation density in shaping coastal dunes along the Outer Banks? And two, do dune grasses shape dune morphology in species-specific ways? So in terms of methods, we conducted plant community surveys and beach and dune topographic surveys starting in 2016, where we established a shore normal transect running from the mean high water line over the dune. And we used a real-time kinematic backpack GPS to walk these transects. And doing that, we recorded the profile of the beach and the dune. And then we also established quadrats every 5 meters across the dune, where we measured vegetation and counted the number of stems of each species. So using those topographic surveys, we're able to identify major beach and dune morphometric features. So as you can see, the toe, crest, and heel of the dune, I first identified their position and elevation, as well as that of the mean high water line. And then using these features, we can calculate metrics such as beach width and dune height, as well as 2 different slope metrics. So the slope between the toe and the mean high water line, and then a more localized slope metric around the mean high water line. In addition to that, we also use LiDAR data to calculate shoreline change rate, which acts as a proxy for sand supply to the beach, and is essentially the amount of sediment either being added to or removed from the beach over time. In terms of data analysis, I did model selection using linear regression models, where I had a set of response variables related to dune morphology and a set of explanatory variables related to sand supply, beach geomorphology, and vegetation density. And the goal was to see which of these metrics could best explain the variation that we see in dune morphology along the coastline. And I then used hierarchical partitioning to determine the proportion of variance explained by each of these explanatory metrics. These are all the variables that were included in these models, calculated at the transect scale. So on the left here, you have the response variables. Like I said, they're all related to dune morphology. So the height and width of the dune and the toe elevation of the dune, and then the change in each of these metrics over a 1-year period. And then the explanatory metrics, we have 2 different shoreline change rates. So one being multi-decadal over 2 decades, and then an annual rate over 1 year. And then 2 different metrics of beach slope and beach width, as well as a number of different grass density metrics, including the changes in their densities over that 1-year period. So I'm just going to start by showing some broad patterns along this region. In this plot on the left, you have the proportional density of these grasses along the coastline from north to south, and in red is Uniola, so you can see that that's by far the most dominant species throughout this region. But there are also latitudinal gradients in the distributions where Ammophila becomes more dominant in the northern region north of Ocracoke Island. And then on the right here, you have multi-decadal shoreline change rate, which again, you can see was really variable throughout the study region. And we tended to see a lot of erosion on the beaches, especially in the southern Outer Banks. Most values were negative. And then in the northern Outer Banks, we saw some more beaches that were actually accreting over time. So I'm just going to start by showing some of my results relating to the relative roles of physical and ecological variables, starting with dune height. To orient you to this graph, we have percent of variance explained on the y-axis, and then each of these 6 dune morphology response variables on the x-axis. And these 6 different colors here represent, these different colors represent the different explanatory metrics included in the models, with colors in tan being related to sand supply and geomorphology, and the ones in green being related to grass density. So for dune height, you can see that measures of sand supply to the beach explain the greatest amount of variation, 76%, whereas dune grass density metrics explain the remaining 24%. One thing to note is that these numbers that I'm telling you are the contribution of each of these variables represented as a percentage of total explained variance. So like any statistical model, there's leftover unexplained variance as well. But in order to better compare between these different metrics, the numbers I'm telling you are scaled to the explained variance. Okay, so looking at the other dune morphology metrics, so total elevation and width, across these three metrics, you can see that measures of sand supply at the beach explain between 71 to 86% of the variation, especially multi-decadal shoreline change rate and backshore slope and beach width being the most important ones. In contrast, grass density metrics explain the remaining 14 to 29%. And these findings are really similar to what work in the Pacific Northwest has shown, where sand supply and backshore slope were the two main things shaping dunes, and then grass is explained around 10% of the variability on that coastline. So just looking into these relationships a little bit more, in these two plots, we have multi-decadal shoreline change rate on the y-axis, and then two different dune morphology metrics, or sorry, on the x-axis, two different dune morphology metrics on the y-axis. And you can see that areas that had a more positive shoreline change rate, meaning that more sediment was being added to the beach over time, also tended to be areas with taller and wider dunes. And then on the right here, we see the relationship between beach width and dune height, which was again positive. So areas with wider beaches tended to have taller dunes, which makes sense, as you may imagine more sediment could be accumulated and transported to the dune over a wider beach. So now looking at those dune morphology change metrics, we found interestingly that dune grass density variables were more important to these changes in dune morphology over time, over that 1 year period, so representing between 36 to 49% of the explained variance. And looking at these patterns in a little more detail, again, we have dune morphology metrics on the y-axis and changes in Ammophila tillers over that 1 year period on the x-axis. And you can see on the left here that areas with shorter dunes were also areas that had a greater increase in Ammophila tillers, whereas on the right, areas with an increase in Ammophila density were also areas with a dune increase in width over that time period. So we know from previous work that Ammophila grows more laterally and more densely than the other species, and because of this tends to have higher sand accretion. So when more sand accretion is occurring at the leading edge of a dune where it's growing laterally, as you can see here, we see an increase in sand deposition at the toe of the dune and possibly a decrease in deposition in the landward direction, which means that when you have high sand accretion and the fast lateral spread of Ammophila, you end up having this increase in dune width at the toe. Okay, so to conclude, we found that measures of sand supply to the beach were most important in explaining variation in dune morphology, while grass density metrics explained a lower but still significant proportion of variation in dune morphology. And interestingly, they were most important to dune morphology change metrics, which was a pattern that was largely attributed to changes in Ammophila density. And these findings are really similar to previous work in the Pacific Northwest, as I mentioned, suggesting that these processes are similar across both coasts. So thinking about the implications of these findings, we know that dunes help regulate coastal hazard exposure and are also highly vulnerable to climate change. And given that climate change warming temperatures may change the ranges of these grasses. So in the middle, you can see the distributions of Ammophila and Uniola. So Ammophila is in orange, Uniola is in blue. And we know that Uniola is more drought and heat tolerant. So as it may be able to expand its range northward and displace Ammophila in parts of its current range. And this could lead to shifts in dune morphology and resulting ecosystem services, such as coastal protection, given that we know that these grasses influence the dune in different ways. All right, so now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about my work measuring carbon storage across the Outer Banks. So there's been a lot of recent interest in coastal ecosystems. They've been recognized for their capacity to store carbon and their role in global carbon cycling and climate regulation, in particular in salt marsh, seagrass, and mangrove ecosystems. And previous work has shown that while they're less widespread than terrestrial ecosystems, these coastal systems can actually accrete or bury more carbon per unit area. So if we look at this graph on the right, this is showing you carbon burial rate in grams of carbon per meter squared per year for these 6 different ecosystems. So these 3 are forests, and then these 3 are coastal systems. And in general, you can see that the values are much higher in these coastal ecosystems. And some of the reasons for this is that these coastal systems can accrete sediments vertically over time and even keep pace with sea level rise. And carbon can also be imported from other systems into these coastal ecosystems. So coastal ecosystems tend to have high productivity, and as I mentioned, high sediment accumulation rates, allowing them to store carbon both in their sediments below ground and in their vegetation above ground. You can see an example of this in the salt marsh, where you can see how the sediment has been accreting vertically over time, and that allows them to store a lot of carbon below ground. So what about in coastal dunes? Dunes are a widespread coastal ecosystem that often has dense vegetation and high sedimentation rates. There's only been a handful of studies quantifying carbon storage in dunes, primarily in Europe. And these previous studies have found rates ranging from somewhere between 6 to 70 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. They also found that there was a lot of variability between different dune habitats. And one thing to note is that these studies only measure the top 15 centimeters of dunes. So we don't know very much about how it may vary with depth. So there's an important need to better understand how much carbon is being sequestered in these systems and how it may vary with factors including vegetation, geomorphology, and sand supply. So the main questions guiding this work were first, how much carbon is out there in the Outer Banks? And then how does it vary between different carbon stocks as well as spatially among islands and dune profile locations? Second, how does carbon storage vary with depth in dunes? And then lastly, what physical and ecological factors influence the variability that we see in carbon storage along the coastline? So you've seen this map before, and for this study, we selected a subset of 11 sites to measure carbon, and those ranged from Cape Lookout in the south up to Body Island in the north. And in addition to those field surveying methods that I already described in chapter 2, we also collected sediment cores to 1 meter depth in across three different dune profile locations. So you can see what those different habitats look like on the right here. So the dune toe tends to be kind of an open shifting sand environment and have lower vegetation density. As you move landward to the crest, the vegetation becomes much denser and taller. And then at the heel of the dune, you tend to have the highest diversity and density of vegetation. And also sometimes you have some woody shrubs as well. So after coring in each of these locations, we brought the cores back and extruded them on the beach using a custom built extruder. And we extruded sediment at 2 centimeter increments and then brought the samples back to the lab for analyses. So using the samples that we collected, I was able to calculate carbon stocks in three different carbon stocks, so above ground vegetation, below ground vegetation, and sand. And in order to calculate the above ground stocks, we used the grass density measurements from the field surveys, as well as the grass shoot weights from samples that we collected, and then percent carbon measurements in those grass tissues in order to calculate how much was stored in vegetation at each site. For the below ground vegetation, I sifted out the below ground biomass from these core samples, and then used the sample volume and percent carbon measurements in those samples in order to estimate how much carbon was stored in the below ground biomass, or the below ground vegetation at each of these sites. And then lastly, for sand carbon, we had bulk density measurements of the sand samples and used loss on ignition to determine percent organic matter. And then on a subset of those, we used elemental analyses to determine percent carbon. And in this process, we were able to calculate sand carbon on a per volume basis in dunes. So I'm just going to quickly start by addressing the second question, which was whether dune carbon storage varied with depth. In this plot, we have depth in centimeters on the y-axis, ranging from 0 at the top to 100 at the bottom, and then two different x-axes for sand carbon density and below ground grass carbon density, where the sand variables are shown in shades of tan and the grass variables are shown in shades of green. And we found that there was no statistically significant difference with depth in these carbon storage metrics, which was contrary to our expectation that carbon storage would be highest at the top of the core and then would decrease as you move down. But because there was no difference, we were able to integrate measurements across the cores for the remainder of the analyses. So I'm going to start by presenting some broad patterns first. On the y-axis of this plot, we have kilograms of carbon per meter squared. And then on the x-axis, you have island from north to south. And you can see that there was variation between islands in terms of the magnitude as well as the proportion contained within each carbon stock. Overall, below ground plant carbon was the largest and most variable component, so that's shown in this olive brown color. And that was followed by sand carbon, and then above ground carbon was the smallest in green. So we can see that below ground carbon is really important in these dune systems, as has been shown previously in terrestrial grasslands. which is unsurprising given that we know that dunes have these really deep, extensive rhizome networks. So now that I've shown you some values, you're probably wondering how these values compare to other ecosystems. So this table is showing you some comparisons between the Outer Banks and previously measured dune ecosystems with sediment organic carbon content and above ground biomass. And you can see that these two systems in Italy and the UK had higher values in terms of their sediments. And one possible explanation for this is that at least in the UK dunes, they had much higher vegetation productivity as well. So above ground biomass ranged from 1,200 to 1,400 grams per meter squared in comparison to 100 to 350 in the Outer Banks. Interestingly, there were some measurements from Georgia, Sapelo Island, which had really similar values to the North Carolina Outer Banks, suggesting that these values may be relatively consistent across the central Atlantic coastline. So sediment organic carbon stocks, as well as above ground storage, also tended to be higher in eelgrasses, salt marshes, and terrestrial grasslands. So you can see here, eelgrasses were the most similar, where their lowest values were similar to the highest values in dunes. But then when you look at salt marshes and terrestrial grasslands, they tend to have much higher values at least in their sediments. Interestingly, the above ground values were relatively similar across terrestrial grasslands and eelgrass beds and dunes. So now that we know how much carbon is out there, I'm going to show you how it varies spatially, starting with carbon storage in the above ground vegetation. And these tables are showing you some results from ANOVAs using island and profile location and their interactions as factors. And then in the graph, you have above ground plant carbon on the y-axis, and again, island from north to south on the x-axis. And you can see that there were differences both by island and by dune profile location, where the dune toe has significantly lower values in almost all cases compared to the crest and the heel, whereas the differences between the crest and the heel were typically not significant. But overall, you can see that carbon storage tends to be lowest at the toe, which makes sense since I told you that that's where vegetation density is also lowest. We found really similar patterns in the below ground carbon stocks, which also varied by island and profile location. And in all cases, the values at the toe were significantly lower compared to the crest and heel. And you can see that the values were pretty consistent across islands, except for this one in the middle, which was Ocracoke Island, was much higher, and we don't really know why that is. And then lastly, sand carbon density also varied significantly across islands and dune profile locations. And we observed kind of a latitudinal gradient where the sites in the north tended to have less carbon in their sands compared to the sites in the south. And then also a landward gradient where the dune heel usually had the highest values compared to the toe and crest. So after exploring these spatial patterns, I then ran multiple regression models to determine which physical and ecological factors were most strongly correlated with sand carbon density. And looking at this table down here, I'm just showing the top model result with sand carbon density as the response variable. And you can see that it was negatively related to both sand deposition and backshore slope, and then positively related to grass density. And in this plot here, we have sand carbon density on the y-axis and sand deposition to the dune on the x-axis in meters per year. And you can see that there was a pretty strong negative relationship where places that had greater deposition to the dune were also areas that had less carbon in their sands. So it appears that high dune sand supply can dilute dune carbon by delivering low carbon content beach sands, and also by reducing the carbon contribution from the grasses, effectively lowering sand carbon density. One striking example of this you can see up here. So this is showing you the dune profile over 3 years and how it's changing with elevation on the y-axis. And this was at Body Island. And you can see that there was over 1 meter of sand deposited to the dune at the toe, crest, and heel of the site. And this is also the site that had the lowest sand carbon density. So in comparison to these other two sand supply, grass density explained a much smaller proportion of the variance, which contradicted our expectation that above ground vegetation would be one of the most important factors driving carbon storage. And the lack of a strong relationship with between dune grasses and sand carbon could be a consequence of how sand deposition interacts with dune grass density across islands and profile locations. So to go into these patterns a little bit more, first focusing on the top right here, regional patterns. So when you compare across islands or transects, we found that areas that had high sand deposition, so for example, Body Island in the north, they also tended to have high grass biomass. And then in these areas, sand carbon density was low. And this makes sense because of the positive relationships between sand deposition and grass density. And then when you look across profile locations, we saw a negative relationship between sand deposition and grass density. So at the toe, you tend to have the highest sand deposition and the lowest grass density, whereas at the heel, we had the highest grass density and the lowest sand deposition. So under these conditions, we found that sand carbon varied from low at the toe to high at the heel. And we can see that the feedbacks between vegetation and sand regionally and locally help explain why we observed both high and low sand carbon densities associated with high grass densities. So to conclude, we found that the North Carolina Outer Banks had lower carbon stocks compared to previously measured European dunes. But one thing to note is that these Atlantic coast dune ecosystems are a much more widespread habitat, so it's still really important to understand this ecosystem service and quantify it. In addition, carbon stocks tended to increase both with latitude and with distance along the dune profile, where the dune heel had the highest carbon stocks. And then because the feedbacks between dune sand deposition, grass density, and sand carbon density were self-reinforcing at both high and low sand deposition, the relationship between vegetation and sand carbon storage was complicated and depends both on the effects of sand deposition and its direct effects on carbon storage. All right, now I'm going to talk about my fourth chapter, where I examined the role of marine subsidies and sand supply on dune grass production along the North Carolina Outer Banks. So given that we know that dunes are really important, or dune grasses are really important in shaping dunes, it's necessary to understand the factors that drive dune grass productivity. There's been surprisingly little research in this area. So dune sands are thought to be relatively nutrient poor based on the environmental conditions in dunes. So sands tend to be highly leached and have low water retention and low rates of soil formation. However, dunes can still be relatively productive habitats. So one possible explanation or source of nutrients comes in the form of marine subsidies. And ecological subsidies are defined as the flow of energy, nutrients, and organic matter between ecosystems. And these connections can have important implications for ecosystem functioning, especially when you have a more productive donor habitat subsidizing a less productive recipient habitat. So in beaches and dunes, these subsidies can come in the form of marine nutrients, specifically macrophyte rack that washes up on the beach and dune, as you can see in these photos here. So it can be deposited on the beach and then decompose over time. And then these nutrients can be transported landward via nearshore and aeolian processes. And then nutrients in seawater can also be delivered to the beach via wave runup. So how can we know if dune plants are using marine nutrients? Stable isotope analysis provides a mechanism to test this hypothesis that dune grasses are utilizing marine nutrient sources. Specifically, delta 15N is the ratio of the heavier nitrogen isotope, 15N, to the lighter nitrogen isotope, 14N, relative to an international standard, which is atmospheric nitrogen. And this is measured in per mil. So specifically, terrestrial plants tend to be depleted in 15N, while marine nutrient sources are typically enriched in 15N. And because we know that the nitrogen composition of plants should reflect that of their environment, we would expect to see more enriched delta 15N values in grasses that are relying on these marine subsidies. Few studies have explored the nitrogen stable isotope composition of these grasses, but there has been some work here on the Pacific Northwest coast by a previous PhD student of Sally's, Vanessa Constant, who found strong evidence that grasses in these dunes were relying on marine subsidies. So she found that grasses at the toe of the dune were enriched in 15N compared to those growing further away from the beach. And she also found a positive relationship between grass density, rack biomass, and sand nitrate levels on the beach. And one thing that's interesting is that the coastal waters off of North Carolina, which are a possible source of nutrients to dunes, are considered to be relatively nitrogen limited in comparison to the nutrient-rich waters off the coast of the Pacific Northwest due to upwelling. So we were really interested in seeing whether the dune grass reliance on marine nutrients would differ across these two coastlines. So the two main questions guiding this work are first, what factors, including rock biomass, sand nitrate levels, and beach and dune geomorphology are important to dune grass production metrics and dune grass tissue nitrogen content in the form of %N and delta 15N in dune grass tissues? And then do dune grasses utilize marine derived nitrogen? And if so, does that signal vary across dune profile locations and islands? So for this project, we used all 112 of our study sites, and you've seen this map before. But one thing that's especially interesting about this region is that there's an offshore boundary in ocean circulation offshore of Cape Hatteras, where cold shelf and slope currents, such as the Labrador current up here, are flowing southward along the mid-Atlantic Bight region, and then the Gulf Stream is flowing northward, which is much warmer, and it turns eastward offshore of Cape Hatteras. So this boundary and ocean currents may impact the delivery of marine nutrients to the coastlines. In particular, the waters north of Cape Hatteras tend to have higher levels of dissolved nitrogen compared to the waters south of Cape Hatteras. And then because of these gradients in water temperature also, Cape Hatteras acts as a biogeophysical transition zone for marine life. So that includes things like phytoplankton and macroalgae. So in conjunction with the field surveys of vegetation and topography that I already described, we also did surveys of macrophyte rack at each site in order to estimate its abundance. And we collected samples in order to measure biomass and to determine the composition of rack at each of these sites. We also collected sand samples at the toe of the dune at each site, where we were able to use a potassium chloride extraction method to measure sand nitrate levels in these samples, which an undergraduate, Lucas Parvin, played a key role in collecting these measurements. And then in terms of dune grass production and dune tissue nitrogen metrics, first we had shoot density values from the field surveys for all these grasses, and then biomass metrics from the collected samples. So using these, I was able to calculate the combined grass density and biomass of the 4 different species at each profile location and transect. And then using the collected grass samples, again, at each profile location and transect, I measured delta 15N and %N in dune grass tissues. So I'm going to start by showing some regional patterns in rack abundance and composition along the coastline. So in this plot on the left, we have macrophyte rack biomass on the y-axis and island from north to south on the x-axis. And you can see that rack did vary between islands. There was no latitudinal trend that you could see. Some places had almost no rack, and then North Core Banks in particular had a really large amount of rack. One thing to note that may explain this strange pattern is that we collected these samples very soon after Hurricane Matthew, which may have resulted in large deposition of rack in some areas and not others. So that likely explains this pattern. And then looking at this plot on the right, you can see the proportion of rack biomass and how it varies, or the composition of rack biomass and how it varies along the coastline, again, from north to south. So we found that the sites in the north were dominated by an eelgrass species, Zostera marina, so that's these green bars here. And then the sites in the south had this brown algae species, Sargassum. And there was a really distinct gradient in the composition of these samples as you went past this Cape Hatteras region. So that was kind of what we predicted and was really interesting. So now I'm going to show some regional patterns in sand nitrates, dune grass production, and dune grass tissue nitrogen content. So starting with sand nitrates on the left, you can see that sand nitrate concentration did have somewhat of a latitudinal pattern where these 4 Northern Outer Banks islands, again, north of that boundary that I talked about, had higher sand nitrate levels compared to these Southern Outer Banks sites. And we saw a very similar pattern in dune grass tissues as well. So this plot is showing % nitrogen in dune grasses by island and profile location, so toe, crest, and heel. And you can see that the northern sites, again, had higher levels of nitrogen in their grass tissues compared to the southern sites, which was especially pronounced here at False Cape and Body Island especially. And then this top plot is showing you patterns in dune grass shoot density across the region. And you can see that there was less variability in grass density, especially at the crest and heel. It was relatively consistent across sites. And then at the toe, there tended to be lower density values at some sites. One thing that was interesting was this really high value at False Cape, so that there's really dense grasses at the toe of this dune. And we also know that this site has high sand nitrate levels and higher % nitrogen in the dune grass tissues, and has a lot of Ammophila growing there because it's in the north. So these factors are suggesting a potential connection between nutrient levels on the beach and the amount of nitrogen in dune grass tissues. So now looking at regional and local patterns in dune grass delta 15N. Again, this plot is by island and profile location, showing you delta 15N in dune grass tissues. And you can see that the marine derived nitrogen signature was greatest at the dune toe, where values were more enriched in 15N, and that decreased as you moved landward across the profile. Especially the crest and heel had much lower values, except for False Cape and Body Island, suggesting that these sites still had grasses that were enriched in 15N at the crest as well. So after exploring these spatial patterns, I then conducted multivariate analyses to examine the factors that were important to dune grass production and tissue nitrogen content. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you some of the main takeaways from these analyses. But overall, I found that dune grass density, %N, and delta 15N were most strongly related to measures of sand supply, dune height, and sand nitrate levels on the beach. So first, we found that sites with higher dune grass %N in their tissues and higher shoot density tended to be sites with more negative shoreline change rates, taller dunes, and higher levels of sand nitrates on the beach. And then sites with higher dune grass delta 15N tended to have more positive shoreline change rates, taller dunes, higher sand nitrate levels, and steeper beaches. In particular, shoreline change rate was most important at the toe of the dune, where the delta 15N values were also greatest, suggesting that marine nutrients being delivered to the beach and dune were ultimately being incorporated into dune grass tissues. In addition, backshore slope and dune height were most important at the dune crest, suggesting that the taller dunes that had steeper beaches were receiving more marine nutrients. Just to show you this in another way, so steeper, narrower beaches with greater sand supply tended to have more marine nutrients and also greater levels of delta 15N and grasses at the toe of the dune. And then taller dunes also were sites that had more delta 15N, more %N, and higher grass density. So our results suggest that beach and dune morphology in combination with sand supply can mediate the delivery of these marine derived nutrients across the dune profile. So first, by supplying varying levels of sand to beaches and dunes, so that's related to sand supply. Second, by changing the area over which nutrients can accumulate, which is related to the morphology of the beach. And then lastly, by acting as barriers to nutrient delivery, which is related to the height of the dune. So to conclude, we found strong latitudinal gradients in rat composition, as well as sand nitrate levels and dune grass tissue nitrogen metrics along this coastline, which were related to oceanographic conditions and sand supply. We also found that dune grasses growing closer to the beach had a more marine nitrogen signature, which decreased with distance across the dune profile. And then lastly, interactions between sand supply, beach and dune morphology, and sand nitrates on the beach all contributed to variability in dune grass productivity along this coastline. And again, these results were very similar to findings on the Pacific Northwest coast. Interestingly, the delta 15N values on the Pacific Northwest coast were quite a bit higher at the toe than those on the North Carolina coast, which makes sense given that we expected that there are more nutrient-rich waters off that coastline, and we'd expect dune grasses to rely more strongly on these marine nutrient subsidies. So overall, the findings of my dissertation elucidate the processes that shape foredunes, their vegetation, and their carbon storage capacity along the central Atlantic coastline, which is an area that's highly vulnerable to coastal erosion and sea level rise. So it's really important to better understand the role of the grasses in shaping dune morphology. And this is critical to better understand how dune morphology may change in the future with changes in coastal protection services as a result. And my work is also the first comprehensive inventory of carbon storage along this coastline in North America, especially. And it's really important to quantify this ecosystem service in dunes to then understand how it may change in the future with various factors that could influence dune habitat areas, so things like sea level rise and increasing storm intensity in this region. And then lastly, understanding where dune grasses are getting their nutrients and what's driving productivity in dunes is really important, given that we know that dune grasses play a critical role in shaping dunes. So my research is the first of its kind on this coastline, allowing us to compare with previous studies to verify that these patterns are universal in dunes across different coasts and globally. All right, thank you all so much for listening. Now I want to take a few minutes to acknowledge all of the people who have helped me along the way and made this dissertation possible. So first and foremost, I want to thank my advisor, Sally, for all the opportunities she's given me and all of her support throughout this process. Her insight has been invaluable in everything from fieldwork to interpreting my data, to crafting research questions and grant applications. And Sally has always been there to support me and has pushed me to become a better scientist. And I'm very grateful to her for everything she's done. I also want to thank everyone on my committee who supported me over the last 5 years. So first, Peter, who's taught me so much about quantitative coastal science and geomorphology, and is always there to answer questions about dune geomorphology. I'm really grateful for all of his insight and feedback on my research. I'd like to thank Becca for all of her support and scientific guidance over the last 5 years, and Duo for teaching me about statistics and for stepping in to be my statistics minor professor at the last minute. Thank you so much for that. And then Steve also for all of his support and for being my graduate council representative. There are a lot of people to thank who are involved in the North Carolina project. First, I especially want to thank Laura Moore for all of her advice and feedback on my research and for sharing her expertise in coastal geomorphology and barrier island processes. And then thanks to all the folks from OSU and UNC who worked on this project and who helped us out in the field, especially Paige and Michael and Ian and Elsa Marie and many others who came out into the dunes with us and dealt with all kinds of conditions, ranging from flooding to tropical storms and more, to help us collect data even while they were working on their own PhDs. And I had a ton of fun in the field with all of you. I'm also so grateful to have met all the wonderful people in the Hacker Lab, including former and current students who are here today. Thanks so much for all the fun times in the office and in the field, and I really enjoyed getting to know you all. I also want to acknowledge the contributions of undergraduate researchers who are included as authors of some of my work and have spent many hours helping out with sample processing and lab analyses and made this dissertation possible. So thanks especially to Lucas and Judith and Julia and Annalise for all their hard work. And then also I want to thank Jennifer McKay, Kylie Welch, and Miguel Goni for all of their help with elemental analyses and Delta 15N analyses, and especially for making sure that I got my samples in time to finish my dissertation during a pandemic. Many thanks to everyone in the IB department for all their support, especially the grads for creating such a supportive community, and also the 4 Ts in the office, Teresa, Tracy, Tara, and Trudy, who do so much to make our lives easier as grad students and do everything they can to help us out. I'm grateful to all my friends in Corvallis, as well as old friends, for all their support and making my time in grad school so much fun. And I especially want to acknowledge all my friends in Corvallis who've been so supportive over these last few months while I was working on my dissertation nonstop. I really appreciate all of your encouragement. Many thanks to my family, including my parents and my brother, for all of their love and support over the years. My parents encouraged my love of the natural world and biology from a young age, and they've also done so much to support me in my education over the years, so I'm very grateful to them. And then lastly, my partner Cedric for being my biggest supporter throughout grad school. He's helped with everything from fieldwork, as you can see up there. He came out to the dunes multiple different times in North Carolina to help me out. He edited my writing, all while doing his own PhD. And he was always down to go on adventures with me, so I really appreciate him. And then lastly, my funding sources, NOAA, the Garden Club of America, the Geological Society of America, and the IB department. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Let's see. So we're going to do next, just take questions. We've got some people within the committee that are listening, and then we have some people in the audience. So I'm not going to micromanage it. I'm going to let Teresa take any. So raise your hand if you have a question online, and Teresa will unmute you and allow you to ask the question. And then obviously if people have questions in the audience, just raise your hand and we'll unmute you. We don't have that.
They do have Francis.
Great, Francis.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, hey, Katya, hey, beautiful dissertation. Congratulations. What a fantastic body of work. I wanted to just ask you just to speculate a bit about kind of the Pacific Northwest versus Southern Atlantic comparison. So we're also different in terms of how much nitrogen gets deposited. Where you work, it might be, an order of magnitude higher in atmospheric deposition of nitrogen than what we do, what we see in the Pacific Northwest. Does that change your interpretation at all? Does that, when you think about what's similar or different about these bi-coastal systems?
That's a really good question, Francis. And that's definitely something that I thought about. We know that atmospheric deposition is higher along the East Coast compared to the Pacific Northwest. And that's something that we observed in the dune grass tissues behind the dune. They had more negative values closer to 0, which suggests that these grasses are using atmospheric nitrogen. But I'm not sure how that would necessarily be impacted by atmospheric deposition. And that's something that definitely would like to think about more. That's a really good point.
Yeah. Actually, if I can have a follow on, because I was thinking about, what are the other ways you might be getting to a negative value in part of your system? And one is, of course, the source, but the other is the degree to which the closeness or the openness of the nitrogen cycle. If the nitrogen cycle is kind of cranking through a lot, you can have lots of fractionation and have a kind of apparently enriched system. Is there any data or information you know of that to rule out whether the front of the, Sal's going to kill me. I have the lingo wrong. The front of the dunes might they be processing nitrogen at a faster rate than the rest of the dune?
So you're asking if there's data out there whether the toe of the dune is processing nitrogen faster compared to the rest of the dune? Yeah, not that I know of, but that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, cool. Somebody should follow up, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to talk about it more.
All right, good job. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah, John?
Yeah, awesome presentation. Congratulations. You mentioned several times the occurrence of hurricanes on the East Coast. And I'm curious if and how that impacted your system in general, but particularly sort of the profile and how you're measuring carbon and what influence that you think that had on the measurements of carbon.
Yeah, I think it definitely did affect our carbon measurements, especially because Hurricane Florence happened about 8 months before we did those measurements, and that was a really destructive hurricane. There was a ton of overwash and erosion, a lot of places where the dune was completely wiped out. And because of that, some of the sites that we measured actually ended up being the kind of what used to be behind the dune and was now the foredune, because what was the foredune had been removed. So in a few places that was the case. And I think that's part of why we saw higher carbon values in some of those sites, because they were what was previously kind of like behind the heel of the dune. Yeah.
So Sarah Hamilton had a question and she had to leave. So she was just wondering what method you use to estimate percent carbon in the samples for your third chapter.
Yeah, so in the sand samples, we sent them into a lab where they measure percent carbon directly in the sand. And then we also use loss on ignition to measure organic matter in the sand. And then same thing for vegetation. We grind up samples of the tissues of the grasses, and then they get measured in a lab, which tells you percent carbon and nitrogen in those tissues. Yeah, Rebecca.
Great talk, Katya. Super awesome. I was wondering, so you did a good job in your third chapter at the end of kind of summing up like all of the factors that affect the carbon storage in a dune. If you had a community that was like trying to optimize carbon storage in their dunes, what would be the optimal like carbon sink? What would you tell them to do?
So what would you tell them to do to optimize carbon storage?
Yeah, like in terms of like shoreline, if they could like do affect sand supply and affect what grasses are growing there and affect like the rack deposition, they have a lot of power. This goes to
Great question. Well, it's really complicated because as I showed these interactions between sediment and dune grass growth, because ideally you would have a greater density of dune grasses, but in order to have more dune grass growth, you also need more sand supply since they grow through these feedbacks. But ideally you'd have maybe a low sand deposition and high dune grass biomass, kind of like what we see at the heel of the dune. So if you could somehow make that happen everywhere, you had these superpowers.
Other questions?
John?
One more, sorry. Something stood out to me between your third and your fourth chapters, and that I think you notice in your fourth the gradient of nitrogen concentrations in the system. Think of as higher in the north and lower in the south. Like your carbon storage gradient was sort of the opposite way, so that where there was more nitrogen in the north, it was also less carbon. And so if you have more nitrogen there, that's influencing the productivity of grasses. Do you have any guesses or explanations why you wouldn't have seen actually more carbon in those areas? There's more plant productivity.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I think the patterns in nitrogen were, as we saw, were somewhat related to marine nutrients, which seem to be higher in that northern region. Whereas it seems like there isn't much of a marine contribution in terms of the sand carbon content. And since we see a lot more deposition in that northern region, that was kind of overpowering any effects of vegetation productivity in that area.
Other questions? Anybody online? Great. All right, well, let's give Katya another round of applause. Thank you, everybody who was out there in Zoom world.